Dr. Martha C. Nussbaum is the Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics, appointed in the Law School and Philosophy Department at the University of Chicago. She is an associate in the Classics Department, the Divinity School, and the Political Science Department, a member of the Committee on Southern Asian Studies, and a board member of the Human Rights Program. She has taught at Harvard University, Brown University, and Oxford University. From 1986 to 1993, while teaching at Brown, Dr. Nussbaum was a research advisor at the World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki, a part of the United Nations University. She has chaired the American Philosophical Association's Committee on International Cooperation, the Committee on the Status of Women, and the Committee for Public Philosophy. She is an academician in the Academy of Finland, a Fellow of the British Academy, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. Among her awards are the Grawemeyer Award in Education, the Centennial Medal of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, the Prince of Asturias Prize in Social Sciences, the American Philosophical Association's Philip Quinn Prize, and the Kyoto Prize in Arts and Philosophy. Dr. Nussbaum received her BA from New York University and her MA and PhD from Harvard. Will Martha C. Nussbaum please come forward? On behalf of the administration, faculty, staff, and students of the University of Hawaii, the Board of Regents is proud to confer the honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree upon Martha C. Nussbaum, this 16th day of December, 2017.
Interim Chancellor Lassner, Regent Moore, faculty, parents, and friends, and above all, you graduates. Aloha. You've all achieved so much, and you are embarking on so many different life paths. May these be fruitful and richly productive. So first of all, I want to say how moved and humbled I am by this honor. Mahalo to all of you. But really, this day belongs to you. On this day of celebration, in this incredibly beautiful state of Hawaii, I want to ask you to pause to think for a moment about a painful social problem in America right now, the problem of anger. But I'm going to ask you to step back from our politics and to think about the ending of a tragic drama, the Oresteia of the poet Aeschylus, written in Athens in the 5th century BCE, a mythic allegory about the founding of democracy. So this three-part drama concerns revenge. To avenge the killing of her daughter, Clytemnestra murders her husband Agamemnon. To avenge that killing, Orestes murders his guilty mother. But at the end of the trilogy, something very different happens. The goddess Athena introduces democratic institutions, trial by a jury selected by lottery from all the citizens of Athens, rules of evidence, in short, democracy and the rule of law. The Furies, the ancient goddesses of revenge, are no longer in charge. Law is in charge. And even their character has to change. As the final play begins, the Furies are repulsive and horrifying, vomiting up clots of blood that they've swallowed from their prey. They barely speak, they just make animal noises, real horror movie stuff. As Clytemnestra says, "In your dream you pursue your prey, and you bark like a hunting dog hot on the trail of blood." Unchanged, these bestial forces could not be part of a democracy dedicated to due process and legal justice. But the Furies are transformed. Lull to repose the bitter force of your black wave of anger, Athena tells them. And they agree to drop their passion for payback and to look with kindly eyes on the well-being of the city and its people. They even describe their new mood as a mindset of common love. Above all, they begin to listen to reasoned arguments, debating about how to advance the good of the city. Now, Aeschylus's drama is a parable of democracy, and one with a very strong and controversial message. It is that retributive anger is ugly and poisonous to democracy. Like the United States today, the ancient Greek democracy had a big anger problem. If you read their historians, you'll see some things that are not unfamiliar. Individuals litigating obsessively against people they blame for having wronged them, groups blaming other groups for their lack of power, citizens blaming prominent politicians and other elites for selling out their dearest values, other groups blaming foreign visitors or even women for their personal and political woes. Our current political moment knows these problems all too well. But there's one difference. The Greeks had a lot of anger, but they did not embrace or valorize it. They did not define adulthood or manliness in terms of anger, and indeed tended to associate it with childishness, or even, as with those Furies, with bestial and repulsive creatures. However much they felt and expressed anger, they waged a cultural struggle against it, seeing it as destructive of human well-being and democratic institutions. What Aeschylus does in the play is to show us first the ugliness of anger and its danger to democracy, and then, second, how it might possibly be overcome by listening to persuasive arguments, by that mindset of common love, and by a civil and rational discourse focused on the well-being of all. Now, I believe that Aeschylus is right. Anger is a poison to democratic politics. But we have to say much more about what we need to get rid of and what we need to keep. After all, many people think it's impossible to care for justice without anger at injustice, and that anger should be encouraged as part of a transformative process. Many people also believe that it's impossible for individuals to stand up for their own self-respect without anger, that someone who reacts to wrongs and insults without anger is spineless and downtrodden. Still, let's persist for a moment in our Aeschylean skepticism, remembering that recent years have seen 3 noble and successful freedom movements conducted in a spirit of non-anger, those of Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela. Surely, people who stood up for their own self-respect and that of others, and who did not acquiesce in injustice. They fought for freedom without seeking revenge, and they achieved at least a part of what they fought for. So why do people so often think that anger is noble and important to the fight against injustice? I want to suggest that anger has 2 parts, one of which is indeed valuable and noble, and the other of which is pernicious. Let's turn to philosophy for a minute. Aristotle's definition of anger, which was done about 100 years after our play, has been accepted by most philosophers in the Western European tradition, and it's also very close to Hindu and Buddhist definitions. I think particularly eloquent is Shantideva's great Buddhist work on anger. Now, the agreed position is this: anger is a painful emotion reacting to a significant damage to someone or something that you care about. and the damage has to be seen as wrongfully inflicted, not just accidental. So far, I think, so good. Of course, we can get the facts wrong about who did what to whom, and we can also get values wrong, thinking that something is very important when it's actually trivial. Aristotle says that a common cause of anger is when somebody forgets your name, so we can see that life has not changed so much in lots of respects. But if we're right about the facts and the values, then it's right to notice the damage with pain, and it would be right to protest against it and to try to change things. Taking note of wrongdoing and protesting it is incredibly important to democracy, as we see currently from the work of the Me Too movement in recent days, the Black Lives Matter movement, and here, the Hawaii sovereignty movement. But there's another part of anger that's not so benign. Aristotle says that an angry person typically looks forward with pleasure to some type of payback, inflicting some type of retributive suffering on the offender. This might not seem obvious, but in fact, all definitions of anger, including Gandhi's own definition of anger, include this wish for payback as a part of normal, everyday anger. Now, we should understand that the wish for retribution could be a very subtle wish. The angry person doesn't need to wish to go out and take revenge herself. She may simply want the law to punish the wrongdoer, or even some type of divine justice. Or she may even more subtly simply want the wrongdoer's life to go very badly in the future, hoping, for example, that your cheating boyfriend or girlfriend has a miserable dating life in the future. I think if we understand the wish in this broad way, Aristotle's right. Anger does contain a sort of strike-back tendency, and that's what differentiates it from, for example, compassionate grieving. Contemporary psychologists who study anger empirically agree with Aristotle in seeing this double movement in it, from pain inflicted to retributive wishes and actions. Now, this wish for payback arises in all kinds of situations. Parents who have lost a child to violence often think that they will only achieve closure if the state executes the killer, a life for a life. But really, the brutality of capital punishment does not restore what was lost. As Gandhi is reported to have said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Or take divorce. Betrayed spouses often feel entitled to seek punitive divorce settlements and child custody arrangements, as if that somehow made things better, and as if punitive payback somehow restored the balance of power or rescued their damaged dignity. But in real life, the function of payback is usually far less benign. Two people become locked in a struggle for pain, focused on the past, and often inflicting great collateral damage on children and friends and family. In the end, the betrayer may get his comeuppance, but what does that achieve? By focusing obsessively on the past, people become closed to new possibilities, and they often become bitter and unpleasant. Retaliation is ugly, as Aeschylus shows in his portrait of the Furies. But wait a minute, we all agree, don't we, that wrongful acts, if they're serious enough, must be punished, and that punishment is typically painful. Yes, I think we should all agree that punishment is often useful, but why and how? We might see punishment in a purely retributive spirit as payback for what has already happened. That's the attitude I've been criticizing, and it does great social harm, leading in our own society to a gruesome pile-on-the-misery strategy of mass incarceration, as if that really compensated for the damages of crime and made things better. But there's a better attitude, more like what happens at the end of Aeschylus's play. We might try to look to the future and produce a better society, using punishment to express the value we attach to human life and safety, to deter other people from committing that crime, and perhaps to reform the offender. If we think this way, however, trying to improve the future, we ought to have a lot of other thoughts before we get to punishment. People don't do wrong nearly as often if they're basically loved and respected. if they have enough to eat, if they get a decent education, if they're healthy, if they foresee a future of employment opportunities. So thinking about wrongdoing should lead us in the direction of designing a society in which people are treated from the beginning with respect and given decent opportunities, and thus have fewer incentives to commit crime. If they do, despite our best efforts, we take that seriously for the sake of the future. So anger does not guide us well. When we're angry, we charge ahead toward payback without really thinking about what is best for society or even for ourselves. We should understand, however, that the two parts of anger can come apart. We can feel outraged by the wrongfulness of an act or an unjust state of affairs without wanting payback for the wrong done to us. So protest without payback. Take parents and children. Parents often feel that their children have acted wrongfully and they're very upset. They want to spotlight the wrong and somehow to hold the child accountable. But parents usually avoid retributive payback, or at least they should. They rarely think, today at least, now you've got to suffer for what you have done, as if that by itself was a fitting response. Instead, they ask themselves, what sort of reaction will produce a better future life for that child? Usually, this will not be a painful payback, and it certainly won't obey the eye for an eye principle. Instead, they'll typically choose strategies that get the child's attention, expressing clearly how and what the child did was wrong, and they give positive suggestions for the future, how to do things differently. So loving parents typically have the protest part of anger without the payback part. And that will be a clue to my positive proposal for democratic society, where I fear we are not lovers of our fellow citizens. It is indeed difficult to love one another and to live in hope and faith when society is profoundly unjust. Martin Luther King Jr. said that people came to his movement for racial justice full of anger, wanting to strike back and do a lot of damage. What the movement then had to do was to keep the good part of anger, the protest part, but to get people to abandon the destructive payback part in favor of an attitude of love and brotherhood and a determination to work with others in a constructive spirit. In an essay written in 1949, King said that racism could be met in two very different ways. Quote, one is the development of a wholesome social organization to resist with effective, firm measures any efforts to impede progress. The other is a confused, anger-motivated drive to strike back violently to inflict damage. Primarily, it seeks to cause injury, to retaliate for wrongful suffering. It is punitive, not radical or constructive, end quote. King was not just speaking hypothetically, he was describing the actual contrast between his own nonviolent approach based on brotherly love, hope, and faith, and the approach of Malcolm X, who, at least as King understood him, favored violent retribution. King insisted consistently that his approach did not mean acquiescing in injustice. There's still an urgent demand, there's still a protest against unjust conditions, in which the protester often takes great risks with his or her body in what King called direct action. Still, the protester's focus must turn to a future that all must work to create together, with hope and with faith in the possibility of justice. Hope is hard, and love is even harder when the opposition is mean-spirited and seems to be full of racism and sexism, and sometimes utterly lacking in basic respect for human equality and dignity. The society that King confronted had these faults to a very extreme degree. Everyone in his movement knew that lynchings of black men and rapes of black women were a daily business. We've inched a little bit beyond this, and it's only by vigilant protest of the wrongs of racism and sexism that we can keep ourselves from sliding backwards. In this situation, looking for payback makes people feel strong and in control. We'll destroy those awful people. Our internal furies carry us onward, And we actually come to believe that we will come out ahead if only we make those people suffer. By contrast, love and the search for brotherhood can leave us feeling terribly exposed and vulnerable. And I think that's why in America today, people are so unwilling to put their trust in those constructive forces and so thrilled by displays of the bogus manliness of payback. It might seem strange to compare King to Aeschylus, though it's really not so strange at all, given King's vast learning in literature and philosophy. He's basically saying the same thing. Democracy must give up the empty and destructive thought of payback and move toward a future of legal justice and human well-being. King's opponents portrayed that stance as weak. Malcolm X said sardonically that it was like some coffee that has had so much milk poured into it that it didn't even taste like coffee anymore, and it was white and cold. But that was wrong. King's stance was strong, not weak. He resisted one of the most powerful of human motives, the retributive impulse for the sake of the future. One of the trickiest problems in politics is to persist in a determined search for solutions without letting fear and insecurity deflect us onto the track of rage and retribution. The idea that Aeschylus and King share is that democratic citizens must face with courage the problems and, yes, the outrageous injustices that we encounter in political and social life. Lashing out in anger and fear does not solve the problem. Instead, it leads, as it has all too often in history, to a spiral of retributive violence. There's a better alternative. Aeschylus knew it, and King both knew and lived it. And Hawaii tries to live by it, I think, by following the spirit of aloha. Making a future of justice and well-being is very hard. It requires self-examination, personal risk, searching critical arguments, a lot of imagination of the experiences of others, and uncertain initiatives to make common cause with opponents in a spirit of hope and what we could call rational faith. It's a difficult goal, but it's that goal that I'm recommending for both individuals and institutions. Now, as it happens, you have all received that sort of liberal education that promotes critical thinking, respectful debate, and imaginative, compassionate understanding of the experiences of different types of people. And now, let's hope you will be able to take these values out with you into the wider world. If we all try our best to follow that path, we may possibly, even here in anger-torn America, attain the result that Aeschylus poetically imagines at the conclusion of his drama, quote, that in plenty, the blessings that make life prosperous may be made to burgeon from the earth by the sun's radiant beam. Congratulations, and may you live toward both happiness and justice.
Thank you, Dr. Nussbaum, for those wise and inspiring words.